Hi, my name is Alyssa LeCan. I'm the Youth and Community Educator here at the Museum of Danish America. Thank you all for coming to our Brown Bag Lunch series, and we thank Dennis Anderson for sponsoring this series for us. Today we welcome Anna Redsand as our speaker, and on her topic we're looking forward to hearing from. So thank you, Anna.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Alyssa. So I'm happy to be here today to talk with you about this very remarkable woman, Nella Larsen. Nella was a Danish African American author of Danish children's games, of several short stories, and of 2 novels, Quicksand and Passing. She was born in Chicago to a Danish immigrant mother and a Danish West Indian immigrant father. We would probably not know about her today if she hadn't written and published Quicksand and Passing, the 2 novels. And it's especially through Quicksand that we know things about her time in Denmark and also her time in the US. Because Quicksand is a very autobiographical novel. The main character's name is Helga Crane, and when you hear me mention Helga Crane, you can sort of think Nella Larsen, because Helga is really Nella's alter ego. I'm going to focus a lot on her connections with Denmark and her Danish connections, because I think that's what this group is probably the most interested in. But I will also talk about her time in the US. And I will read some short excerpts from Quicksand to give you an idea of Nella's style and also the things she encountered as a biracial woman in the early to mid 20th century. So you might hear me say probably, possibly, it appears quite often, because there are a lot of things we don't know absolutely for sure about her, especially since some of them come from Quicksand, which is fiction. So just bear in mind that, and there are things that we definitely know about her as well. So Nella was an important figure in the Harlem Renaissance. And if you haven't heard of the Harlem Renaissance, what it was an intellectual and cultural revival of African American music, theater, dance, art, fashion, literature, theater, politics, scholarship, and it was centered in Harlem, in Manhattan, in New York City. And it's something that still plays a big role, the Harlem Renaissance still plays a big role today in our culture. It was also known at the time as the New Negro Movement. And so I'm just going to mention that when I'm reading, you will hear the words Negro and colored, because those were the words that were being used at that time to refer to Black people or African American people. So Nella's mother was Marie Hansen, and she probably was born in Schleswig. And after the Dano-Prussian War ended and Germany took over Schleswig, she probably moved to Askau. And then at the age of 17, she immigrated alone to Chicago in 1886. And Marie was a seamstress, and this shows up a lot in Nella's writing. Because Nella always stayed very interested in fashion, in fabrics, and this is a picture of her in 1927 doing needlework. And so when I read some of these things, you will hear her interest in color and fashion and style. So I'm going to introduce you to Nella's lush style and give you an example of her passion for these things. These are the opening pages in Quicksand. So it begins with Helga Crane. Remember, Helga Crane is also Nella Larsen. Helga Crane sat alone in her room, which at that hour, 8 in the evening, was in soft gloom. Only a single reading lamp, dimmed by a great black and red shade, made a pool of light on the blue Chinese carpet, on the bright covers of the books which she had taken down from their long shelves, on the white pages of the opened one, selected, on the shining brass bowl crowded with many-colored nasturtiums, beside her on the low table, and on the oriental silk which covered the stool at her slim feet. It was a comfortable room, furnished with rare and intensely personal taste, flooded with southern sun in the day, but shadowy just then with the drawn curtains and single-shaded light. An observer would have thought her well fitted to the framing of light and shade. A slight girl of 22, with narrow sloping shoulders and delicate but well-turned arms and legs, she had none the less an air of radiant, careless health. In vivid green and gold negligee and glistening brocaded mules, deep sunk in the big high-backed chair, against whose dark tapestry her sharply cut face, with skin like yellow satin, was distinctly outlined. She was, to use a hackneyed word, attractive. So you can tell from the skin color that's mentioned, the like yellow, like skin like yellow satin, you can tell that Helga, as well as Nella, is a biracial character. And that will be important as we move along here. So Peter Walker came from the Danish West Indies, and if you get the America letter, you might recognize this map as coming from the spring 2022 issue of the America letter. That issue talked about some archaeology that was being done in the Danish West Indies on St. Croix, and it is possible that Peter actually did come from St. Croix. In fact, it's quite likely. He was probably familiar with the Danish language, which would have facilitated his relationship with Marie. It was more common at that time for Scandinavian immigrants to enter into interracial relationships. American folks would have known what some of the consequences would be, how difficult their lives would be if they intermarried. But the Scandinavian immigrants were not aware at that time of the anti-Black segregationist climate in Chicago. Peter Walker, her father, actually disappeared from the Chicago directory in 1891, the year that Nella was born. And later on, Nella would say that he had died before she could know much about him. So she got, at that time, she was known as Nellie Walker, but her mother remarried Peter Larsen, who immigrated from Denmark in the 1880s. And they probably married also in 1891, about the time that she got pregnant with Nella Larsen's half-sister, Anna. And after that marriage, Nella became known as Nella Larsen. We only know for sure that Nella went to Denmark when she was a child based on the ship's return manifest. The Marie, Nella, and Anna went to Denmark, and they returned in 1898 when Nella was almost 8 on the SS Norge. We don't know how long they stayed there, and it was probably in Askø, but they stayed long enough that Nella had actually learned Danish before she returned. So one of the other ways that we know about her time there was that her first 2 publications were in a magazine that was intended for all children, but especially for Black children. It was called the Brownies Book, and it was founded by W.E.B. Du Bois, who was an important figure, almost the founder of the Harlem Renaissance. And it was there to support positive identity, racial awareness, but also connections with other countries, like Nella's connections with Denmark. So what she published were children's games that she had learned while she was in Denmark. And I just want to see those of you who have Danish heritage, if any of you recognize these, the names of any of these games. Maybe you might have played them in English or in Danish. Anybody know about the fox game? Anybody heard of that? Hide the shoe? The king is here. That one is very much like Simon Says. It's a game where once the caller said, the king is here, then you were supposed to do what they told you to do. But if they didn't say the king is here, even if they said the king is coming, you were not supposed to do whatever they said. So anybody heard of that? No. Hawk and pigeons? Okay. So she also published some riddles, and I'm going to see if anybody knows these riddles. One of them is, when does a man have 4 hands? Anybody heard that one? When he doubles his fists. At what time was Adam born? A little before Eve. In other words, evening. When the clock strikes 13, what time is it? Time to repair the clock. Yeah. So as the only person of color in her family, she had a hard time in certain ways, and in other ways she was quite well protected. So when dressmaking customers came to the apartment, she was probably seen as a seamstress assistant, not as a family member, and the family allowed that perception to go on. I'd like for you to hear an example of what it was like for Helga or for Nella within her family in the US. Although this is about her extended family, you'll soon see how alienated Nella would become from her immediate family as well. I think a little water before I start reading. So Nella, or Helga rather, goes to the home of her uncle Peter to get some assistance after she leaves a job. And when the maid answers the door, Helga doesn't realize that her uncle has gotten married. And a maid answers the door, and the maid says to the wife, she says she's his niece, ma'am. Well, have her come in. There was no escape. She stood in the large reception hall and was annoyed to find herself actually trembling. A woman, tall, exquisitely gowned, with shining gray hair piled high, came forward, murmuring in a puzzled voice, "His niece, you say?" "Yes, Helga Crane. My mother was his sister, Karen Nilsson. I've been away. I didn't know Uncle Peter had married." Sensitive to atmosphere, Helga had felt at once the latent antagonism in the woman's manner. "Oh, yes, I remember about you now. I'd forgotten for a moment. Well, he isn't exactly your uncle, is he? Your mother wasn't married, was she? I mean, to your father." I don't know," stammered the girl, feeling pushed down to the uttermost depths of ignominy. "Of course she wasn't." The clear, low voice held a positive note. "Mr. Nilsson has been very kind to you, supported you, sent you to school, but you mustn't expect anything else. And you mustn't come here anymore. Well, frankly, it isn't convenient. I'm sure an intelligent girl like yourself can understand that." "Of course," Helga agreed coldly, freezingly, but her lips quivered. She wanted to get away as quickly as possible. She reached the door. There was a second of complete silence, then Mrs. Nilsson's voice, a little agitated. "And please remember that my husband is not your uncle. No, indeed. Why, that would make me your aunt. He's not." But at last the knob had turned in Helga's fumbling hand. She gave a little unpremeditated laugh and slipped out. When she was in the street, she ran. Her only impulse was to get as far away from her uncle's house and this woman, his wife, who so plainly wished to dissociate herself from the outrage of Helga's very existence. She was torn with mad fright, an emotion against which she knew but two weapons, to kick and scream or to flee. So even though she experienced this kind of alienation from family, Mary and Peter were also protective of Nella to a certain extent due to the increasing racism in Chicago that sometimes ended in a violent push for segregation. And while Marie, Nella, and Anna were in Denmark that first time, Peter Larsen moved the family home to a more mixed neighborhood that would be less problematic for the family. They also made sure that she was educated. In fact, she was more well educated than her half-sister Anna would be, and they realized that that would be important for her future as a biracial young woman. So the first school she went to was Wendell Phillips High School, and this is the oldest black high school in Chicago, although at the time that Nella attended there, it was mostly white. And her training as a writer basically came from Wendell Phillips High School because the focus of the English classes was on creative writing. And it really informs things like her lush descriptions, her strong storyline, and her character development. However, the family was upwardly mobile, and they bought a home in a neighborhood called Englewood, and that was a much more segregated white neighborhood, and they felt that it was less safe for Nella and for the family. And so when she was 15 years old, they sent her to Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, and she was there from 1907 to 1908. She hated Fisk. Most of the students there, it's a historically black university, and most of the students there were from the South, and they had strong black family connections, which she didn't have. Her mother did visit her there once. We know this from a school newspaper. The English focus there was not on creative writing, but on grammar, sentence structure, but also Greek mythology, which does show up in her writing. And she was a competent writer as far as grammar and sentence structure goes, which I think is important. So they had a very strong, very stringent rules about contact between the sexes, and also a very stringent dress code. And as you know, Nella was interested in color and fashion, and she broke the dress code. She wore more flamboyant clothes and jewelry, which was frowned upon. And it was given as one of the reasons that Nella and 8 other young women were asked to leave the school at the end of Nella's first year. So yes, that dress code was very important. I think she was probably glad to get away as well. And that is when she took her second trip to Denmark. She went back to Asko, and she attended the Grundtvig Folk High School there. And it seems that she probably spent a year there during the time that she was 16 and 17. She came back to the US for a visit, and then in 1909, from 1909 to 1912, she went back to Copenhagen to stay with relatives. And in Quicksand, Helga Crane stays with her Aunt Katrina and her husband Herdal, who we don't ever get a first name for him. But the place that they stayed was actually on Maria Kirkeplatz, or that was where her aunt lived. So this building happened to be for sale on the internet, so that's how I was able to get a picture of that. And we don't know for sure that that's where Nella stayed, but it's quite possible. She did stay with family when she was there. And from Quicksand, it's very clear that Nella knew Copenhagen very well. And so I'm going to just give you some ideas of places that she wrote about in Quicksand. the Danish Folk Museum, which is no longer by itself. It's now part of the National Museum, but at the time it was across the street from this art studio that she visited. She writes about the changing of the guard at Amalienborg Palace. She walked a lot in Copenhagen, and one of the places where she walked was on Gammel Strand, where the fishwives are selling fish. And of course, the Hard Rock Cafe wasn't there when she was there. But the reason I have this picture here is that there was a cafe in the same building where the Hard Rock Cafe is now, right next to Tivoli. It was called Café Villeli, and her aunt actually took her there to tea. She also, of course, writes about Smørrebrød, and she writes about Magasin du Nord, the huge department store in downtown Copenhagen. So in Denmark, people see Helga as exotic, as a curiosity. So she's more accepted there than she was by her family in the U.S. and by just in general in the U.S. But her relatives wanted to accentuate her difference, and some of it was for their own benefit, as you'll hear in this excerpt. So they try to dress her in a way that accentuates her exoticness. This is a little bit about how she experienced that. When she was dressed in the shining black taffeta with its bizarre trimmings of purple and cerise, Frudal approved of her, and so did Herdal. Everything in her responded to his, "She's beautiful, beautiful." Helga Crane knew she wasn't that, but it pleased her that he could think so and say so. But a little frown appeared over the fierce mustache as he said, "She ought to have earrings, long ones." Not only were earrings bought, long ones, brightly enameled, but glittering shoe buckles and 2 great bracelets. Helga felt like a veritable savage as they made their leisurely way across the pavement from the shop to the waiting car. This feeling was intensified by the many pedestrians who stopped to stare at the queer dark creature, strange to their city. Her cheeks reddened, but both Herr and Frudal seemed oblivious of the stares or the audible whispers in which Helga made out the one frequently recurring word, sorte, which she recognized as the Danish word for black. So they go to tea. The dolls were pleased with the success she was at tea, or rather the coffee, for no tea was served. It sounds like Denmark, doesn't it? And later at dinner, Helga herself felt like nothing so much as some new and strange species of pet dog being proudly exhibited. Everyone was very polite and friendly, but she felt the masked curiosity and interest so discreetly hidden under the polite greetings. The very atmosphere was tense with it. As if I had horns or 3 legs, she thought. She was really nervous and a little terrified, but managed to present an outward smiling composure. This was assisted by the fact that it was taken for granted that she knew nothing or very little of the language, so she had only to bow and look pleasant. So near the end of her time, or actually, Helga also attended the University of Copenhagen. And it was probably a non-degree program. She was not a degree student. It was an open university program. And by this time, she was a fairly fluent speaker of Danish with good reading ability and fair writing ability, which fits with the amount of time she had spent there. However, she starts to get discontented. And this is described in Quicksand as a reason for returning to the US, but she also felt a lot of ambivalence about returning. And this sort of discontent, restlessness, ambivalence is a theme throughout Helga Crane's life, and it's also a theme throughout Nella's life, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. But this is how she started to feel as she's considering coming back to the US. Well into Helga's second year in Denmark came an indefinite discontent, not clear but vague, like a storm gathering far on the horizon. It was long before she would admit that she was less happy than she had been during her first year in Copenhagen, but she knew that it was so. And this subconscious knowledge added to her growing restlessness and mental insecurity. She desired ardently to combat this wearing down of her satisfaction with her life, with herself, but she didn't know how. She asks herself, go back to America where they hated Negroes, to America where Negroes were not people, to America where Negroes were allowed to be beggars only of life, of happiness, of security, to America where everything had been taken from those dark ones, liberty, respect, even the labor of their hands. To America where if one had Negro blood, one mustn't expect money, education, or sometimes even work whereby one might earn bread. So of course what she's writing about is the early 20th century. She does return to New York City, and instead of going to Chicago where her family is, and the reason that she didn't is probably because it was very painful to be living in Chicago but not be allowed to live with her family. So she returns and goes to New York City, and at that time there were 3 professions that were open to educated Black women, teaching, librarianship, or nursing. And you had to have a high school diploma to go into teaching or librarianship, and she did not have a high school diploma, which was not required for her to go to nursing school. And so she did attend the Lincoln Hospital and Training School for Nurses, graduating in 1915 and passing her RN exam with honor, which was rare at that time. She stayed on at Lincoln for 5 months, and then she went to Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. There she was the head nurse and superintendent of nurse training school, and she had some reason to think that it would be similar to the school in ASCO, because in Grundtvig schools, there was a lot of emphasis on what the community needed and then training people to actually be able to meet the needs of the community. So there was a lot of emphasis on training people in the trades. And that was an emphasis at Tuskegee too, but she became really disillusioned. She was training young women to become nurses, but in the South, nurses were, especially Black nurses, were considered domestics rather than professionals, and that was disillusioning for her. But also she had to work. She worked 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, and at the end of a year, she just said she'd had enough. She went back to New York, and she sat the civil service exam to become a public health nurse, which was an investigative and educational position. She passed the exam with the second highest score, and she was hired in the Bureau of Preventable Diseases. So she went around in the neighborhood that she was assigned to, educating people and investigating things like diphtheria, scarlet fever, TB, VD, and then the Spanish flu epidemic hit, and that's where this picture comes from. It's not that different from COVID, as we've probably all read about at some point or heard that comparison drawn. In 1919, Nella married Elmer Imes, who had gotten the second PhD in physics in the US, and his specialty area was quantum physics. They shared a lot of interests, and his social connections in the Black community, which was centered in Harlem, helped Nella gain entrance into what was becoming the Harlem Renaissance. Soon after they moved to New York, to Harlem, Nella became involved with the 135th Street Library, first as a volunteer, and she was heavily involved in promoting the first Negro arts exhibit, and it was said, or in the newspapers, that it was probably the most comprehensive collection of Negro artwork and handicraft ever assembled at one time. They had art exhibits from Africa as well as from the US. Soon after that, she left public health nursing and took a 33% pay cut to be a junior library assistant. So she's starting to move towards her interest in literature and the arts, and actually moving towards what she would end up doing that made her famous, her writing. She sat the exam to enter the New York Public Library School, which was actually a very prestigious library school at that time. She also had to show that she had the equivalent of a high school diploma, since she didn't have one. And so she listed her schooling in Asko, at the University of Copenhagen, at Wendell Phillips High School, at Fisk University, and Lincoln Nursing School. She was the first African American who was admitted to the New York Public Library School, and she was also the only one who didn't have a high school diploma. Everyone else had at least a high school diploma, and the majority of the students had college degrees. But she did well, and she ended up being hired as a children's librarian, first at the Seward branch and then at the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library. And as she became part of the Harlem Renaissance, she was socially drawn less to exclusively Black society and more to diverse integrationist settings, for example, in Greenwich Village. And one of the reasons for that is that that Black elite society could also be excluding. And we have an example of that from Helga when she decides she wants to stay in New York after she's been hired by a very wealthy public speaker, a Black woman, who wants her to go with her from Chicago to New York. And when that woman hears that Helga is thinking about staying in New York, she says, "Well, I think I can help you get a job." And then she says, "I wouldn't mention, by the way, that my people are white if I were you. Colored people won't understand it. And after all, it's your own business. When you've lived as long as I have, you'll know that what others don't know can't hurt you." And so it's just another example of how Nella feels on the outside in both contexts, really. And this is part of how she's marginalized really by both whites and Blacks, by Danish society and American society, and it results in her lifelong conflicts over her mixed race, despite the fact that she has many, many successes. So Quicksand is published by Alfred Knopf, who is it's a very prestigious publishing company that was probably more involved than almost any other publishing company in publishing Black literature. And it was published in 1928. I picked this cover just because I think that the clothing that the woman is wearing sort of exemplifies again Nella's interest in fashion and color. Prior to Quicksand's publication, she did publish several short stories in pulp magazines that were establishing her credentials for future publication. I'm always interested when I'm reading a book, if it's not obvious why a particular title has been chosen. I'm always interested in trying to figure out as I read, well, why did they pick this title? Because the word quicksand never appears in the text. So what I figured out, or what I guess, is that, when my image of when somebody falls into quicksand is that they're just flailing around, trying to find their footing, and they're not able to find their footing. And I think that this book is really an exquisitely poignant portrayal of what it is to not fully belong in either world. And you see that Nella has many location moves, many career moves, which is partly because of what was available to her as an educated biracial woman without a high school diploma. But it's also due to her restlessness and that kind of discontent that I read about a little earlier, and just about her own inability to find her place in the world. And I'm going to read a little bit that I feel like exemplifies that, and this will be the last reading that I do. This is when she gets back to New York, back to Brooklyn, back to New York City and to Harlem. Something of that wild surge of gladness that had swept her on that day when she had again found herself surrounded by hundreds, thousands of dark-eyed brown folk remained with her. These were her people. Nothing she had come to understand now could ever change that. Strange that she had never truly valued this kinship until distance had shown her its worth. How absurd she'd been to think that another country, other people, could liberate her from the ties which bound her forever to these mysterious, these terrible, these fascinating, these lovable dark hordes. Ties that were of the spirit, ties not only superficially entangled with the mere outline of features or color of skin, deeper, much deeper than either of these. Thankful for the appeasement of that loneliness which had again tormented her like a fury, she gave herself up to the miraculous joyousness of Harlem. The easement which its heedless abandon brought to her was a real, very definite thing. She liked the sharp contrast to her pretentious, stately life in Copenhagen. It was as if she had passed from a heavy solemnity of a church service to a gorgeous, carefree revel. This certainty of the division in her life into two parts, in two lands, into physical freedom in Europe and spiritual freedom in America was unfortunate, inconvenient, expensive. It was, too, as she was uncomfortably aware, even a trifle ridiculous, and mentally she caricatured herself moving shuttle-like from continent to continent. From the prejudiced restrictions of the New World to the easy formality of the Old, from the pale calm of Copenhagen to the colorful lure of Harlem. So I think that really describes how much she felt she was in quicksand for much of her life. So in 1929, her second book, Passing, was published also by Alfred Knopf. And I'm not going to read from Passing, but give you a short summary. There are two women in this book who are both light enough to pass, and what passing means in that context is being Black or being a person of color, but being light enough to pass as white. So there are two women, both of whom are light enough to pass, one who does and one who doesn't. Claire, who is passing, is married to a white man who doesn't know that she's Black. And he directly and often expresses his hatred for Blacks to her and to her Black friends who are light enough to pass. So she starts to long to spend time with other Black people and keeping it secret from her husband. She wants to use Irene, who doesn't pass, to meet Black elite society. And Irene feels like it's dangerous for Claire to do this, and at the same time, she disapproves of her passing and of her taking the risk of being seen in Black society. But out of loyalty, not to Claire herself, but to the race, she protects Claire from discovery. But all the time that you're reading, at least it was this way for me, you know that disaster is coming. And of course, a book needs some disaster to make it interesting, but it's scary enough that it's hard to read it sometimes. So the book is again about in-between status and about belonging and not belonging. And this is a very simplified summary. In some ways, I feel like Passing is a more complex book than Quicksand was. There are ways that Nella drew on her own experiences for passing also, but it's far less autobiographical. There were times when she went to the South when she did pass as white, but she was dark enough that she was probably seen as a foreigner, possibly from Spain. And she's also rumored to have passed at times later in life in New York City. And in 2021, Passing was made into a film by Rebecca Hall, who herself is a biracial woman, so it was a very personal project for her. It's available for free on YouTube if you're interested in watching it. Again, there comes a point where you can just tell that a disaster is going to happen, and it feels very personal in a way that, I read a lot of mysteries and thrillers, and I don't feel that same kind of terror that I felt when I was reading and watching the film. There's a great recommendation, right? So after the publication of Passing, she has a short story published in Forum, which is a very prestigious magazine, and she was the first African American to have a story published there. But that turned into something very negative for her. She was accused, her story was called Sanctuary, and she was accused of plagiarism. The plot and some of the dialogue is very similar to, or almost identical to, a short story by a British author, Sheila K. Smith. And in that one, the dangerous thing was class, or the problem was class, and Nella substituted race for class, and she also wrote in Black dialect. And this is the only time she ever wrote a story in Black dialect. She defended herself against the accusation by saying that it was an old Black folk story and that it had been shared with her by a patient sometime between 1912 and 1915. However, it was very humiliating for her, and it reached the level of scandal in Black literary circles. Despite that accusation, Nella was the fourth Black writer to receive a Guggenheim Fellowship in March 1930. And she used that Guggenheim, the money from the Guggenheim funds, to spend time, almost 2 years, in Spain and France. And the first place that she stayed was in Mallorca. While she's in Europe, she worked on a third novel, and it was called Mirage, and it's about a love triangle in which all the characters were white. Knopf was expecting a third book from her, but they turned down Mirage because they said the plot was just a conventional love triangle story. And whether it was because of the accusations of plagiarism or this rejection, there's a lot of speculation about why, but she was never published again. Her husband, Elmer Imes, became the head of the physics department at Fisk University in 1930 when she received the Guggenheim. And she did not want to go and live at Fisk University because she had such bad memories of her time there as a 15 and 16-year-old. However, she did finally join him there, but he had also started an extramarital affair that was fairly open, and the marriage had really been in trouble for some time because they had lived separately several times. And they divorced in 1933. She received pretty generous alimony payments that supported her until Imes died in 1941. She moved from there to New York City on 2nd Avenue, and that little building in the middle there, that little red brick building, is where she would live for the next 25 years. She moved there in 1939. During that time, she suffered from depression and probably from alcohol or drug use. And she withdrew from her friends to a large extent. She became basically a recluse. And in fact, for 4 years, she completely disappeared from the lives of her friends. But she returned to nursing in 1944. And this is Governor Hospital, where she worked as first a staff nurse, then chief nurse, then night supervisor. And just at the end of her nursing career, she transferred to Metropolitan Hospital, where she worked as a supervisor for the last year of her career until she retired in 1963. So basically, even while she was nursing, she lived socially as a recluse, and she died alone in 1964 at the age of 72. And she was buried by a friend in her friend's Brooklyn plot. There was no gravestone. Her biographer actually went to try to find her grave, and he did find the grave based on the plot number, but as he swept away a lot of dirt, he never found a gravestone. When her half-sister Anna heard that she was going to inherit $35,000 from Nella's estate, she said, "I didn't know I had a half-sister," which was a lie, and one more example of her painful relationship with her family. After her death, Nella's work really fell into obscurity until the 1970s, when neglected women writers began to be republished, and Quicksand and Passing were republished. Today there are quite a few different editions available of both books and also of her short stories. And then in May 2020, Nella was actually honored by the US Postal Service with a stamp. Because there's no gravestone, I decided that I wanted to get a paver for Nella for out front of the museum. I just think that this is a good place to honor her and to honor both of her heritages, her heritage as a Danish child of Danish immigrants and as a Black author. So I actually wrote my check this morning for that. So thank you very much. Are there any questions or comments you want to make? You have? I'm okay. I timed myself many times practicing. Yeah, Terry.
And where is she buried?
She is buried in Brooklyn, New York, yeah. So her friend, who was the executor of her estate, had 4 burial plots, and she buried Nella there. Very few people attended the memorial service or the funeral. So anything else? If I were rich, I'd buy her a gravestone. But a paver is quite a bit less expensive. And a nice way to honor her, I think. Any other questions? Thank you for your attentiveness.